Thank you very much for inviting me to this auspicious occasion, and I hope you don't mind me speaking in English. When I was thinking about the topic for the meeting, I turned to Google, as we all do who research these days, and I Googled what are the responsibilities of public health. And up came 5 topics or themes: infrastructure, healthy communities and behaviours, preventing the spread of communicable disease, protecting against environmental health hazards, and responding to emergencies. Well, I think probably most of us would agree with that, but as a historian, which is the focus of this paper, I would see those types of thoughts and themes as limited by time. And here's another definition, which came from Winslow, American public health pioneer in the 1920s. And I'm not going to read the whole of this definition out to you, but you can see it's a very wide-ranging definition indeed. The science and art of preventing disease, organised community efforts for the sanitation of the environment, control of community infections, education, organisation of services, and the development of social machinery to ensure that every individual in the community has a standard of living adequate for the maintenance of health. So that's a very wide definition of the responsibilities of public health. And it's different to the one which I read out at the beginning. So this notion, I think, of change over time is something which animates my work as a historian and the way I want to talk about this subject. And so this is how my talk approaches the subject of responsibility. Firstly, what is public health? And what is it responsible for? What has it been responsible for in the past? And how that's changed. Then, who is it responsible to and how? Then I want to talk about quite a specific use of the term responsibility. Responsibility deals. Who are the players in public health? And how are they responsible? And finally, I want to end up with a critique of responsibility, the responsibility of public health, which was made by another historian, and leave some thoughts about that. Well, my first theme is what is public health and what is it responsible for? And this obviously has changed substantially over time, and I'm going to use the UK with other European nations as examples. And what I wanted to to emphasize historically is the development of a notion of collective responsibility for the health of the public since the 18th and the 19th century, and then going on into the interwar years. I'll look again at what happened after the Second World War and the rise of the notion of individual responsibility in public health, and then also what's happened more recently. Well, first of all, let's look at the 18th and the 19th centuries. Here, I think the 18th century German states, in particular Prussia, were important. New theories of the state and doctrines of mercantilism involved public health. The interests of the state in building wealth and power required a large and healthy population. So that supported a kind of authoritarian form of public health called medical police. For example, the work of Johann Peter Frank, the physician to the 18th century Habsburg court. But a key period for the rise of public health came with the rise of the modern state in the 19th century. Rapid economic growth, mass urbanization, coincided with high mortality from infectious disease like cholera and typhus. And so the definition and compass of public health at this time was about drains and sanitation, cleansing the environment as a whole. But using England as an example, this wasn't an automatic progression. People didn't see there was a problem, and their problem was the solution of cleansing drains, cleansing the environment. In England, public health reformers such as Edwin Chadwick were seen as authoritarian, and they were strongly opposed in what they wanted to do. Cholera was the engine of public health reform, but when the 1848 Public Health Act was set up with a General Board of Health, of which Chadwick was a member, it only lasted for just a few years. And it lasted really until the mid-1850s. And the Times newspaper very famously said at the time, it would rather take its chances with cholera than be bullied into health. So this use of compulsion in public health was controversial at the time. It was seen as kind of state despotism. And it was controversial in other areas too, the areas of sexually transmitted disease and vaccination, which of course is of particular interest to us now. In the UK, free vaccination was a very early form of state intervention in health, and it was compulsory for young children from the 1850s, and there were very severe penalties after a vaccination act was passed in the 1860s. And these acts, the vaccination acts, were the targets of a very substantial anti-vaccination movement in the 19th century, which secured a clause about conscientious objection in the early years of the 20th century. So you could not be vaccinated if you had a conscientious objection to it. Now, why was this so? Why was there such opposition? Well, there were concerns about the power of the medical profession, medical despotism. There were concerns about safety and also about inequity between rich and poor. There was opposition to government intervention in the liberty of the individual. And similarly, in terms, I'm not going to talk in detail about sexually transmitted disease, but in that area too, there was opposition to what was termed the double standard of morality, compulsion exerted against the women who were involved in prostitution or the transmission of disease, but not against the men who infected them. So public health development and responsibility actually took place at the local level in the last quarter of the 19th century. A new cadre of state bureaucrats developed in England called the Medical Officer of Health, whose role was the provision of health in the community rather than the treatment of individuals. And those responsibilities included sanitary inspection, vaccination, the collection of statistics on disease and death, and improvements in housing. By the early 20th century, the Medical Officer of Health had reached the height of his powers, and I say he because they were mostly men, and had responsibility for a very wide range of state welfare programs to improve the health of children and mothers, school medical services, screening, and in the 1930s also responsibility for hospitals when the Poor Law workhouses began to operate as chronic disease hospitals. Now, there's been a big debate about the responsibilities of public health among historians in the UK, because some argued that these responsibilities were exerted ineffectively. The medical officers didn't adapt to the changing nature of public health problems like malnutrition and unemployment. And there's been substantial research, particularly at the local level, amongst historians, looking at how public health operated in that way. And this, I think, varied very much by locality. And I think this debate is of importance for looking at the responsibility of public health, because the criticism is it was taking on a range of services without a clear idea of what public health was all about. Medical officers were overstretched in running health services. There's a newer historical interpretation which I think gives a more positive view of this very wide range of responsibilities. It stresses the integration of prevention and cure, and also the important role which a strong-minded individual, like the medical officer of health, could play at the local level, the individual responsibility for health in terms of the community was important. Now, of course, this wasn't the same, I'm talking about England, but it wasn't the same in all countries. In America, there was also suspicion of central despotism, and so public health action was less important at the federal level and more important at city or state level. And in Germany, an imperial hygiene department was set up in the unified nation in the 1870s. But of course, in Prussia earlier on, in the 1848 revolutions, health had been associated with democracy and the removal of poverty. So we've seen how the idea of collective responsibility for population health animated 19th century public health. And I think this has tended to dominate the way in which we think about public health historically. But I think as the incidence of infectious disease declined in the 20th century, so the notion of public health responsibility shifted. After the Second World War, it appeared that an epidemiological transition had taken place. Chronic conditions such as cancer and heart disease overtook infectious disease as the leading causes of disease and death. And so from the 1940s and the 1950s, epidemiological studies began to demonstrate a link between individual behavioral habits and chronic conditions. And of course, the most famous, which I've got some examples up on the screen, was the epidemiological discussion of the link between smoking and lung cancer. The work of Sir Richard Doll and Austin Bradford Hill at the London School of Hygiene, and also the researchers Winder and Graham in the United States. And this new view of responsibility also encompassed heart disease, food, and diet in the United States, where the Framingham study of heart disease was an example of the new type of cohort studies. And this type of lifestyle emphasis for public health became the norm in many Western nations in the 1860s and the 1870s, sorry, not 1860s, 1960s and 1970s. Now, this wasn't something that was without criticism. There were a number of critiques of this approach to public health. The historian Jane Lewis, a British historian, criticised public health for not having a clear idea of what it was all about, what it was responsible for. Others criticised that focusing on individuals divorced them from their social environment and encouraged victim blaming. And on the other hand, the commentators who were coming from the radical right criticised what they called the nanny state. Habits which should be left to individual discretion were controlled unnecessarily in the name of public health. And you can see some similarities there with the Times discussion in the 1850s, a century earlier, about being bullied into public health. Well, of course, more recently, things have changed again. They always are in public health. Alongside the focus on individual responsibility, we've also seen a revival of epidemic disease, the traditional responsibility of public health. Beginning with HIV/AIDS in the 1980s, infectious disease has a new role within public health. Ebola in 2014 in West Africa and elsewhere raised old fears of the arrival of infectious disease from far distant countries. Globalization, increased travel, changing climatic conditions raise the threat from new and emerging infectious diseases such as Ebola, and also from novel respiratory infections, of which we've seen COVID most recently. Well, so far I've been talking about public health systems and concepts, collective and individual. Now I want to turn to the idea of responsibility in a different sense. Who is public health responsible to, and how has that responsibility been exercised? And I want here to look at two foci of responsibility. Firstly, politicians, and secondly, the public. Well, turning to politicians first. As systems developed more central responsibility for health, so public health was inserted into the state, not only at the local level, but also at the national level as well. And in the UK, a Ministry of Health was set up just after the First World War, and the post of Chief Medical Officer, or CMO, often called, became the central focus of public health, responsible for advice to politicians. And I think that was the classic position of, or still is, the classic position of speaking truth to power. Now, sometimes that could be a difficult exercise. For example, during the years of HIV/AIDS, the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Donald Acheson, despaired of getting a response to the new disease from politicians. At one stage, he had to use bureaucratic contacts at the highest level in government, and the Prime Minister was finally persuaded that the matter demanded urgent attention. A cabinet committee on AIDS was set up, and a high-level political reaction unfolded. And this was the way, in the course of trying to get this response, he spoke to a leading journalist of the time, Peter Jenkins, and this is the way in which Peter Jenkins wrote about that in the Sunday Times at the time. He said, "I never supposed at one of my occasional lunches with a very senior government official we would be discussing the politics of condoms. Anal sex was mentioned during the avocado, buggery in Her Majesty's prisons as we ate our beef. The very senior official feared catastrophe. Nothing had caused him greater loss of sleep in the whole of his long career as a public servant. Nuclear war, that might happen if we were all very silly, but this is bloody well going to happen. It is happening." So I think that shows the urgency with which the public health chief official saw that politicians should react. But speaking truth to power was not always a straightforward exercise. During the swine flu outbreak in the UK in 2009, the then Chief Medical Officer, Sir Liam Donaldson, again feared catastrophe and used briefings to the press to express his views. But by then, there was another central public health agency, the Health Protection Agency, which took a different, less apocalyptic view, and there was tension between these two sets of public health responsibility. And more recently in the UK, we have seen these tensions play out in relation to COVID, with the Chief Medical Officer, Sir Chris Whitty, and the Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, flanking the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, at press briefings, which have now been discontinued, and sometimes tending to give a flavour of the advice given in private in their careful public statements. Such advice, of course, relies on the public health responsibility for evidence, or what has more recently become called the science. Public health responsibility for evidence goes back a long way. Statistics, or what Condorcet called social mathematics, had developed since the 17th century. And Chadwick also relied on evidence, with civil registration introduced in England in 1837. In Paris, the French statistician Villermé adopted the méthode numérique in exploring the differentials between different arrondissements in Paris. And I think as public health has developed its focus on the individual, so evidence has become more important. This has been notable during COVID, where politicians have been very fond of telling us what the science tells us. Science seems to have replaced evidence in the terminology. The American political scientist Sheila Jasanoff criticized this approach in a recent lecture in Cambridge in the UK. She said it's been argued that language can't be provisional because of public confidence. People would not like to hear anything that was not very definite. But her argument was that provisionality was not inconsistent with public judgment, and that claims should be made less definite to allow for what she called intelligent citizenship. Our Chief Medical Officer, for example, Chris Whitty, recently warned that new waves of COVID will come, but we don't know when, and we don't know what they will be like. Certainly, this type of expression of uncertainty would not be to the liking of our politicians if they were still interested in COVID, which they're not a great deal. So this brings me to the role of public health in relation to the public. Its responsibility is to speak in that direction as well as to power, and for the public to speak back. And I think we've seen two very different versions of public health presented to the public in the past decades and more recently. For HIV/AIDS, the public response was one which stressed human rights, individual liberty, alongside individual autonomy. For COVID, the opposite has been the case, with a stress on types of public health intervention which most imagined to have been left behind in the 19th century, not to be used in the 21st. So here we've encountered control of the population, quarantine, and reduction of transmission through vaccines. And the important role for public health has been in defining these responses, but also in communicating them to the public, because the public has to act upon them itself. And here again, the role of public health communication has a history. As public health became associated with the ability of the individual to improve him or herself, so the role of educating the public became important. And at the local level in the UK, it was the medical officer of health's responsibility to educate the public and women in particular in matters of hygiene and motherhood. You can see that in the slide on the left hand here. As matters of lifestyle became more important within public health, so different methods of communicating to the public developed. In the Second World War, the then Chief Medical Officer, Sir Wilson Jameson, was very proud of the way he talked for the first time about the dangers of venereal disease to the public through his radio broadcasts. It was the first time the radio had been used in that way. And in the 1960s and onwards, the role of the mass media developed through the use of television, appealing to the whole population. And that reached its apogee with the AIDS advertising campaigns in the 1980s. Well, I want to end with a more specific mention of the word responsibility and how it leads us to think about other players and what their role is within public health. What were called responsibility deals were a feature of the coalition, the Liberal Democrat Conservative government, which operated in the UK between 2011 and 2015. And these were deals which brought together different players in the different health arenas, and one covered public health issues. It covered food, alcohol, exercise, health in the workplace. And the aim was to bring industry and public health together with government as part of the nudge agenda to achieve change. And the nudge agenda was the idea that governments would not mandate action, but they would edge the population, they would nudge the population towards certain desired courses of behaviour. But some public health organisations, in particular those connected with alcohol, withdrew from connection with the responsibility deal working groups. They argued that the interests of industry had been prioritised above those of public health. And I think this reminds us that formal public health systems and the systems of public health are not the only players with responsibility for public health. The role of industry has long been controversial, and it continues to be so. And it seems a very long while, looking back, we can see how the early anti-tobacco campaigners in the UK, based in the Royal College of Physicians, checked the statistics in their first report on smoking in the early 1960s with a statistician from the tobacco industry. That type of arrangement, that type of connection, I think would now be unthinkable for public health. And public health, I think, as it has developed around the notion of individual responsibility, has abandoned those sorts of earlier interactions with industry. But it also reminds us that there are other players too in the public health field. Activist organisations around alcohol or food, often modelled on the organisation ASH, Action on Smoking and Health, which was set up in the early 1970s to provide external pressure both on the government but also on the industry. So my point is that formal public health is not responsible for everything in the field, and it needs these external activist players. It's part of a policy balancing act around health and the public. So finally, I just want to end with a criticism of the public health message dating back in history. The American historian Chris Hamlin, made a cogent criticism a number of years ago of public health in the 19th century. And I'll just read out what he wrote. He said, "There was the raw material for making health as prominent a criterion for the assessment of public policy as, say, economics has become. This did not happen. Chadwick and company, Chadwick and his associates, rejected work, wages, and food to focus on water and filth, arguably the greatest technical fix in history." So here's a cogent criticism which extends beyond the 19th century of public health and its abdication of responsibility. Many interventions, for example, vaccination, are technical interventions which do little to address more fundamental issues of inequality and may indeed amplify them in a global sense. And we've seen that in the discussion of the balance of vaccination more recently. Moves to reorient public health around a greater focus on inequality have often not succeeded, as for example in England with the Black Report on inequalities in health, which was published, or rather not published, in the late 1970s. And it's noticeable more recently that the early focus in the UK on inequality and ethnicity in the response to COVID has largely died away in public discussion and also in terms of the vaccination campaign. So here I've given a historian's view of a huge topic, responsibility within public health. I've looked at the way in which public health is defined, its competence and its ethos, the way in which that's changed since the 18th century, and in particular, the rise of the notion of individual responsibility. So in doing that, I looked at systems and organizations, but I've also looked at who within the political system public health speaks to, both politicians, but also the population at large. And here, modes of communication and their change over time, and also what's conveyed in those modes, evidence or science, are important. And then finally, there's who's responsible for getting public health across beyond the formal profession. Who are the other players? Here, opinions differ. Some think that industry should be included, others are adamantly against this. And here we've come across the role of activism and activist organizations. And then finally, there's that overall critique of public health. Does it define its responsibilities too narrowly around what it happens to be doing at the time? And should it have a broader view of inequities in health? So I leave that for discussion later on. Thank you very much.